All right, so we have heard today and yesterday about AI, about performance marketing, about technology, but just today, actually, feelings, emotions, authenticity, I've heard from so many people. My name is David Wellisch, CEO of Collage Group.
And I am David Evans, Chief Insights Officer at Collage Group.
And so the premise for today's session is that cultural intelligence is an imperative, corporate imperative, given what's happening in the American demographic landscape today. Can you go to? We at Collage know something about cultural intelligence. We partner with over 300 brands. We have the most comprehensive database of cultural consumers. And we just launched the only and most sophisticated platform of its kind, fusing brand performance data with consumer insights. We're going to do something different in the next 15 minutes. No fireside. It'll be very interactive, hopefully. So there are no
Depends on you guys.
people, so you're going to be on the spot. So
no,
no switching. No switching. So cultural intelligence, important or not important, and why? Cultural intelligence, important and not important, and why? Who wants to just...
So you can understand your audience a lot better?
Okay. So important.
Yeah.
Important, so you can understand your audience better. Anybody else?
I mean, I'd say if you want to understand an audience that you're not familiar with, right? Like somebody that, or a group of people that you don't maybe know on a day-to-day basis. What are their thoughts? What are they thinking about? What do they like? What do they don't like?
So audience depth. Anybody else?
So you can show up in a culture that isn't sort of it contributes to culture rather than just sort of cannibalizing it.
Additive to culture.
I was going to say every culture is very nuanced in their practices and the depth of it, so understanding them at a micro level is more beneficial.
Great. So it's important. Can we? 1 second.
That's the idea.
Yo te miro, se me corta la respiración. Cuando tú me miras, se me sube el corazón.
All right. So I don't know how many Latinos are in the house, but did anybody feel anything with the music? What did you feel? Happiness. You want to dance. Feelings. So Raja, CMO of MasterCard, said, it's all about transaction, but in order to get to transaction, feelings is the entry point. Authenticity is the entry point. So with this, let's get to a little bit of insight. David.
Yeah, no surprise. I am the Insights Officer. I sound like the Insights Officer. And now we're going to get into some data to actually see that America is deeply transforming. Now, we all know the basic story here, which is that, America is going to be minority-majority in 2050, but the transformation is really happening right now. And it's a subtext to every conversation in this room. So first of all is just the overall demographic transition from a kind of a race ethnicity standpoint. This data, which is census data, shows over 5 years the relative growth rates of the multicultural population versus the white population. And you can see the multicultural population has literally increased by almost 8.5% in that period of time, while the white population has actually shrunk by 2.5%. That is a really, really big gap, right? And that is kind of like a completely baked-in transformation in the American demographic climate, right? So it's really huge. Next thing is, and we've seen a lot of this morning with the panel, there were 2 panels on women in marketing and so on, fantastic, is the transformation in the power of women, right? This is just economic, but of course political power is also huge, and it will be coming up in the election. Women will assume control, according to McKinsey, of between 10 to 20 trillion in investable assets over the next 10 or so years, 10 or 15 years, due to the relatively longer growth lifespans of women, right? Gen Z women right now, according to the latest census data that came out, have 1.32 times the educational attainment of men. Women entrepreneurs drive $2.7 trillion of revenue into the economy, and women of color are starting businesses at 4.5 times the rate of the rest of the population. This is incredibly positive, and it is a huge change. The other thing, and we've heard a lot about Gen Z today, there's a time, like, you can't even talk marketing for more than 10 minutes without talking Gen Z, it seems. But Gen Z is doing so much more than just offering a new group of consumers. They are challenging and changing our identity paradigm. So older consumers, millennials and older, pretty much everyone is in boxes. And no surprise, that's been the kind of American way for, I mean, maybe a century up until 2020. When you answered the census, you actually only had one box you could check on your race and ethnicity. You couldn't check more than one, right? But for Gen Z, there are no boxes. Identity is fluid. And instead of sort of grouping people by shared sameness, right? So I'm in a box with people that look like me. Is this thing on anymore? Yeah, okay, good. That was a shock there. Instead of being in boxes where, you know, it's all about shared sameness, I look the same as people in the box, I sound the same as people in the box, it's now all about sharing a sense of difference from some kind of normative identity, right? So it's because, hey, listen, the world was built not for Gen Z. The world was built for older people, mostly white people. Gen Z is incredibly multicultural. People, you know, who are not going to be saddled with enormous amounts of college debt, for whom housing, you know, was affordable. This is not the Gen Z reality. And so what they're doing is they're embracing all these differences and they're grouping together based on their sense of difference. For me, this is actually an especially salient thing. My older daughter is 23, very much hard to play Gen Z. She was born with a mild disability. In high school, she was fully embraced by the LGBTQ plus community because of the sense of shared commonality of being different than something normative. It really introduced me to something that was like inconceivable when I was a child, that would never have occurred. It's a major transformation, and it's changing more than just Gen Z. Now this, according to our latest tracking data, 4,500 consumers as of the fall of 2023, shows the identification of LGBTQ across different generations, and you see sub-cohorts there. Gen Z, 34%, younger Gen Z, 34% identifying as LGBTQ+. This basically is any type of LGBTQ+ identity that isn't straight. So it includes questioning, which other surveys like Gallup or Pew don't actually include. What's not here, and not shown on the graph though, but is also super powerful, is the rate of change for every other older generation. Even the oldest generation, boomer, when we started doing this 4 or 5 years ago, they were at 3%. Now they're at 6%. That's a 100% increase in boomer identification of LGBTQ+ identity. It's like Gen Z is creating a permission structure for every other generation to do something different with their identity. Super powerful. All right, but what do consumers actually want in this transforming America? So this data always continues to just astound me. The main thing is consumers want brands to engage them culturally, to see them for who they are, not just what they want. And that's all about what David was doing at the beginning with the music, right? It's about who I am. It's about the emotion that's connected to who I am. 72% of Americans think brands and companies should be involved in social and political issues in some way. That is exactly the wording of the question. 4,500 consumers actually answered at that rate. It's enormous. And even though there's been some kind of obvious change since 2020 with the kind of diminution of the social justice movement, that has increased by 14 percentage points in just a few years. So it's still a really salient thing for brands to be involved, for them to connect at the level of that personal identity. Of what it means to be in America today is very different for very different demographics, and brands are being asked to identify with that. All right, how are brands doing? Consumers think brands don't understand them. So we asked the question, do you agree with this phrase? Too many brands haven't done their research when incorporating diversity in their advertising, meaning races, ethnicities, sexual identity, and so on. 2/3 of consumers agree with this. And of course, you'll see the usual suspects, what you might expect. LGBTQ plus on the far left there, Black consumers, Hispanic consumers, Gen Z. What's also newsworthy and coming up more and more, look at Boomer. Boomer is actually the highest here. This constituency of mostly white, more conservative consumers in a very big block is actually feeling themselves left out of the kind of like vision of America that many advertisers are, trying to create. And that's creating obviously a lot of tension. And that tension is part of this underlying phenomenon of, you know what, politics is no longer just about voting or policy. It's about culture. Almost half of Americans say their political views have become an increasingly important part of their identity in the last couple of years, right? So now you have this major tension inside of families, can't even speak to each other. People do not interact across political lines. And what that is a recipe for, you guessed it, backlash, right? I don't know if you guys recognize this. I'm a little too old actually, but my friend over there, my new friend, identified what show it was on in the background. And it's challenging, right? That's the phenomenon. And our data show it's pretty real. About a quarter of consumers are kind of like swing voters. They're like swing consumers, highly activated by what brand stances are. About that quarter will post a negative comment or boycott a brand or stop buying from a brand. But the same quarter will also buy a brand because of stances, right? So if you're in the best position and you're competing in space and you're able to actually articulate that connection more deeply to culture and your competitor fumbles it, you have an enormous potential advantage in stealing market share. So in this transforming America, the question for marketers is, how do you break through to earn the love and commitment of consumers in a sustained way? We believe it requires that brands become culturally fluent. They develop this capability to actually navigate to the deepest level of who consumers are, not just what they want. And as David was pointing out at the beginning with our logos, we work with many really top illustrious brands. Some of the leaders like Disney or P&G or Google Pixel and so on who are really out there, they're doing this, right? They're building what we think is a new kind of mental muscle, cultural intelligence. And this is what they're using to differentiate themselves from the competition. I don't know if you guys remember the panel last night on AI, if you might have been around, it was really interesting. I don't remember the name of the guy from Illumin, I think is the name of the company. And he was talking about, remember, AI is not going to solve this problem for you. AI is just retrospective looking backwards information. This is the role of brand leaders now, is to play, to develop this mental muscle and actually figure out how their brands are going to fit into American consumer choices and identities, for all time to come. So that's where we'll leave it. And now we're more than happy to take any questions.
Sorry. I work for a brand strategy company that does a lot of work in the cultural space. I'm always curious, how do you define the word culture or the concept?
That is a super interesting question. I mean, if you think about the word culture just generically, a set of norms and behaviors and traditions that are usually pretty specific to a particular group, you're not going to get much difference between all the different definitions out there. But the real thing is what's happened to the change in meaning we associate with culture. Traditionally, culture comes from geography. People, like if you went 200 years ago and for almost all of human history, people would only know people within the area that they were from. They would be born, bred there, marry in there, have their children there within like 40 miles, But in the last couple hundred years, that has radically transformed. Culture now is becoming more and more about identities that have been left out of a bigger picture and the need to embrace those identities as they become reappropriated as positives, right? So when you think about the term multicultural, what it's really signifying is not about including more Danes or Norwegians in the environment. It's about actually representing people who have traditionally, certainly within America, not been considered part of the cultural norm. So culture now really means something more about that. It's about embracing these identities that have not been considered part of the historical norm.
It's a good question because it's used differently by different companies. When we engage with many of the leading consumer brands, they think about cultural relevance, being part of the conversation at the right time. That's one aspect. The other aspect is, as you saw, the multicultural growth is driving, it's the growth engine of the country. And so other companies go, we must win hearts and minds of those consumers. Otherwise, the math just simply does not work.
Any other questions?
Donovan Curry. I co-founded a influencer agency here in Austin. I represent some of the top cultural influencers in the United States. My question is, what is the best way to put them in front of a brand that may not understand the culture, right? Like there's a gap or something like that that we're trying to bridge. Maybe they've never heard of them, right? But they can make a huge impact on their brand.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about understanding that consumer group first and foremost, and the role the influencer plays in, making that connection to their deeper identity. And the whole point here is about the why. It's about who I am, right? And where I am in culture, what I watch, what I listen to, not just about the functional needs that I might have. And if the influencer, if your brand, if your clients basically don't understand the opportunity that they need to make that connection, the influencer is a gateway into that intercultural why, that's the opportunity that I would see. And that's what I would imagine you'd want to teach to your clients, is that the influencer is a gateway to that intercultural why that can earn them this immense advantage in deeper love and commitment to the brand that they're trying to sell.
The only add I have is that there are tons and tons of companies. We work with 300 brands, so where they're leading with culture. So I would say, my advice to you is start there. Don't start with the ones that are in the figuring out process.
Yeah, that's for sure. Anything else?
I have a question.
Awesome.
So having brands who want to be involved in culture is one part. The flip side of that is cultural appropriation is something that is likely to occur or can occur. A lot of our brands are concerned about going too far and having people feel like they've appropriated the culture. Do you have any advice, any guidance on how to both leverage the culture without necessarily appropriating it?
Yeah, such a challenge. All of human culture has evolved through appropriation in some form. People borrow, and you see Gen Z doing it like crazy. That's the point of being Gen Z, right, is actually to appropriate and blend all these cultures together. And we do see that, for example, among younger Gen Zs, the priority of race and ethnicity as a major marker of your identity is lower than with older generations because they're identifying with many other things. And it might be something different tomorrow if you survey them again, right? So it's a big challenge for marketers. I think what our general guidance is that real appropriation is when you actually start stealing the copyright and you start actually taking the potential revenue stream of somebody else's ideas. That's the major concern. And the next level down is when you are creating or appropriating something about a particular group that feels really inauthentic to members of that group and they feel that they're disrespected. So you need to do your research to understand that. Actually, on the panel that I'm going to be running on Monday morning, one of the topics is going to be the appropriation of Black English. Right? This is becoming a hot topic. We've just done some research about that. And it's going to show up as something that's going to be bigger and bigger. So that's an example of where do you draw the line about how to do that?
So I work for an international company, and so they're based in France, and so I have to deal with getting them on board typically when it comes to more culturally
we do that
sensitive
too.
things. So as a brand, we are good at representing these different groups in our advertisements and in the imagery and in social and everything. But how do you authentically show up if you've never really done it before in a way that's not going to seem like it's forced or just in real time? And then also there's so many issues going on. How do you pick and choose? And if you pick or choose one or two, is that enough for this consumer anymore?
You can't go too far too fast, right? Yeah. It has to connect with your brand identity, which means you have to know what your brand identity actually is and what it has permission to play in. You have to be very careful about that. I mean, I think of one particular example. It was a brand of an American major truck manufacturer, and they did a Super Bowl commercial in 2019 where they had an overlay of Martin Luther King speaking, and the trucks were pulling some little churches and so on. It was completely out. I mean, even though the Martin Luther King family and library gave permission to use that, they, as a brand, didn't have permission to play in that space. Right? They're just not known enough. They have to earn the right to be able to go that far in one, like you can't do that. So you have to be careful, but you have to start feeling around, seeing where you can make a step and connect it ultimately with your brand identity. If you don't do that, then everyone is going to look at it and seeing it as inauthentic.
So then are there some brands that shouldn't be playing in any of these issues, or is Gen Z and younger generations expecting every brand to have some sort of perspective on at least one thing?
That's a great question. I don't know if anyone is off the hook. I mean, if you think about wanting to create a rational love and commitment as a marketing leader, and you'd want to be able to appeal to Gen Z, and given Gen Z's incredible devotion to their causes and their values in ways you don't see in older generations, the likelihood of that sustaining in the future, I mean, you got to think about it that probably you have to assume you should before you discover you don't need to. That's what I would think about it.
It would be much easier to stay away, right? Clean, no risk, but there's no risk, there's no reward. And I would, to the earlier question, I would start with the business case. And so when you put dollars in front of the business case, then it's all about just being grounded on inside, and you know that you've got to figure it out. Otherwise, you're just, you will be missing an enormous opportunity. But that's always the push and pull in terms of especially international management.
Yeah, we have a number of European brands we work with, and it is interesting. They come in and they are like, wait a sec, this isn't just another European country where there's a single monoculture like the Belgians or something like that, right? It's actually extremely complex inside, and that's something that they have to be educated about. So we do educate a number of European brands about that challenge. And they, it's not as straightforward, but there is learning there. They're learning. I'd also say that it's risky not to do anything, right? It used to be like you could play it safe, but being culturally generic is like a recipe for being forgotten tomorrow, right? You can't do that. You have to find some way of engaging at that deeper cultural level, or you're going to be irrelevant. You're going to be quickly forgotten.
Thank you very much.